Disclaimer: the views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of the guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of USA Global TV and Radio. The content presented is for informational purposes only and is intended to foster open discussion and debate. Viewer discretion is advised. USA Global TV and Radio does not endorse any particular viewpoint and encourages viewers to seek out additional information and perspectives. Saving America with Dr. David D. Schein.
Welcome to USA Global TV and Radio, where our mission is to provide education, entertainment, hope, and inspiration. USA Global TV and Radio connects you with experts and audiences all around the world every single day to help you succeed in business and to live a richer life. Visit us at usaglobaltv.com to learn about career and life-changing training and mentoring programs like the Listening Mentor. Subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about our special programs and offers. Discover how you can become a guest on one of our shows or a host or producer of a USA Global TV and Radio show of your very own. That's USA Global TV and Radio, where the doctor is always in.
Welcome to Saving America. This is your host, Dr. David D. Schein. The news is coming in fast and furious. Let's see what I can take on this week. Elon Musk leads Doge and blasts the big, beautiful bill. To me, Elon Musk is not just reportedly the richest man in the world, he's also one of the most interesting. My understanding is that he came into Tesla as to making billions with the startup of several companies, including what's known as PayPal. The company was struggling and he made Tesla and his own name famous. Many are also familiar with SpaceX, which includes the Starlink satellite Wi-Fi system. And of course, SpaceX recently rescued a couple astronauts who have been stranded by a Boeing satellite. So kind of an interesting situation there. Less well known is his work with Neuralink, which is providing an exciting opportunity perhaps for people with paralysis. He was not very visible in politics, but was considered a Democrat up to his strange and botched purchase of Twitter, which he renamed X. About a year later, he began to openly and strongly support Trump's presidential campaign. He then was the leader and figurehead of Doge. His fortune seemed to have faded with his political involvement. In fact, the disdain for him was far out of proportion to the big victory that Trump won in November. Elon left Doge on May 30th and subsequently set off a media bomb with his strong criticism of Trump's big, beautiful bill. He called it a disgusting abomination. That's a quote. The media has gone crazy on the split between Trump and Musk. I can see both sides of this breach. Trump's tax cuts helped stimulate the economy before the COVID-19 disaster. Absent this pending bill, those tax cuts will go away. That will crush the Trump agenda and many middle-income taxpayers, including yours truly. At the same time, Musk has put his heart into cutting the government waste. This is critical since the federal debt is crushing future generations, and the end to wasteful spending must happen. The proposed bill does increase the federal deficit, based on my observations, about $2.5 trillion. That is terrible. I'm hoping the Senate will cut some of that pork. In the interest of full disclosure, my financial advisor had me make a small investment in Tesla shares about 3 years ago. They have been underwater most of the time since then. So Elon returning to Tesla is a positive for me as well as other shareholders. I anticipate his other business interests are happy to have him back on board as well. American Schein, Boulder, Colorado terrorist attack. I am saddened to learn of the terrorist attack in Boulder, Colorado. I was there to speak at seminars in 2004 and 2005. Ironically, it's one of the most peaceful and liberal places in America. So it's the last place that anyone would expect an illegal alien to firebomb a peaceful protest calling for the release of the hostages held by Hamas. Not all protesters were Jewish. At last report, 15 were injured, including a dog, Two of them critically. One of the injured was a Holocaust survivor. The terrorist is in custody. He has shown no remorse for the attack. Not sure how he expects to support his 5 children while he is likely to spend the rest of his pathetic life in prison. I prefer that he get the death penalty, but that's not likely to happen. I call again not just for the end of anti-Semitism, but for the end of the recent push to persecute religious persons. I caution Catholics and other religions that if the current attempt to stifle the Jews is successful, they will be next. Further, the rhetoric of violence needs to be quashed, and the famous call for peace and love, folks, needs to return. How do Europeans view Americans? After about 3 weeks in Europe, many have asked me to comment on how the Europeans see the Americans. First, my observations are personal. I cannot speak for the entirety of the European people, just as I do not speak for all Americans. I am a professional interviewer, and as a frequent traveler, try never to be the ugly American. So many people will speak with me. Second, I was in Southwest France, several big cities in Belgium, and then in Amsterdam and nearby cities nearby in the Netherlands. I had very little feedback while in France. On the other hand, in Brussels, I had a private 90-minute discussion with 2 representatives from the European Union. This was truly a unique opportunity. Their positions were similar. One was from Austria, the other was from Germany. They like America and Americans, not so much Trump. I found it interesting that little was said about the failed Biden presidency, almost like it never happened. Their position makes sense since the EU must have American financial and military support. However, Trump in his first term, and has returned to that point again, is insisting that the EU countries start to pay their fair share to NATO and help Ukraine. Nobody likes being called deadbeats, after all. The locals in both Belgium and the Netherlands learned English along with their native languages. In fact, most spoke English, American-sounding English, smoothly like they grew up in the U.S. While the liberation of those countries in World War II was 80 years ago, they still credit the Brits and the Americans for coming to their aid to expel the Nazis. No peace yet for Ukraine, Russia. Speaking of Ukraine, the slaughter continues. Putin continues to send record numbers of drones into civilian areas of the Ukraine. He is a war criminal at the highest level. I call for every country on earth to declare him persona non grata. A recent report puts total deaths at an incredible 1.4 million for both sides. Ukraine has recently launched 2 powerful strikes. In an attack over a year in the making, they sent drones into Russia and may have destroyed 40 bombers, or about a third of the Russian fleet. A couple days later, a bomb destroyed the critical highway from Russia into occupied Crimea. Deranged Putin claims he must now retaliate for these latest attacks. But hey, who's been bombing civilians and power plants for 3 years? The CCP threat to world civilization. China is a threat not just to the USA and its allies. It's a threat to world civilization. No matter what your political affiliation, is crucial that the world unite against the crazed CCP leadership. I can speak from experience that it's not the Chinese people. The only reason that Xi and the CCP can get away with this is that the culture is one of little political involvement. And in the 80s and 90s, as the country drifted capitalist, the general population did well. Xi has deliberately tried to walk that success back and restored the failed Marxism of his predecessors. Not only is this ridiculous on its face, it's likely to lead to the end of civilization as we know it on Earth. For proof of this, the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic tied to a lab in Wuhan, China. Millions died and the financial losses were substantial. Fortunately, it appears that China, which cannot be trusted to tell the truth about anything, has lost more people and more wealth than any other country due to this ridiculous leak that happened at that lab. Over the last 5 years, there have been repeated reports of spying by Chinese or for the CCP. I have called on much more dramatic penalties for those spies. Maybe that will happen under the Trump administration. Hasn't happened so far. The very latest is a biological threat stopped at the border by the FBI. A reported Chinese scholar at the University of Michigan was caught trying to smuggle in a biological pathogen. Apparently, this happened months ago, but we're just now finding out about it. This could have been used as a terrorism weapon to destroy food crops. The woman and her boyfriend were arrested. However, I believe in the report it says the boyfriend has now gone back to China. Why is he not in a jail cell? She's been found to have sworn her allegiance to the CCP. A week earlier, another Chinese University of Michigan student was charged with illegally voting in the 2024 election, and he allegedly has already fled the U.S. Why was he allowed to escape? A side note is that last October, 5 Michigan graduates from China who were found on a military facility in northern Michigan in 2023 during a U.S. National Guard training exercise with members of the Taiwanese military. For some reason, the 5 were released and have all returned to China. Why are they not in jail cells? Again, time for long prison sentences and the death penalty applied in the most serious cases. We Americans must demand that our law enforcement rise to the high threat level we are facing. America and its allies must return to the pre-1970 approach of sealing off China until its financial failures allow the sensible people over there to take over.
All rise.
Our series Interviews for Saving America establishes that the world is full of interesting people. Once you hear from our next guest, I'm sure that you'll agree that she deserves the moniker of interesting person. Saving America welcomes Paulette J. Buchanan.
Thank you for having me on your show. I appreciate it. And I hope that the information I give to people will definitely pique their interest and, get people interested in this topic.
Well, we're going to tell people a little bit about you. You've earned an MA in European History and a BA in History and Political Science and Public Policy. You're a former educator who's taught courses across all levels, even at the Navy Education Office on the Groton, Connecticut submarine base. Since 2007, she's worked alongside other victims and legislators in effort to bring about needed changes in the law to better protect individuals and society. She's a member of International Cultic Studies Association and speaks about topics such as cults and the law. She's the author of Fighting for Justice, Religious Fraud, Mental Illness, and the Collapse of Law and Order. This book tells the true story of her quest to protect herself and her family from the abuse and attacks of her brothers that continued from childhood into adulthood. We welcome her back for her second visit to Saving America to update our audience on this important topic.
Yes. I wrote the book actually at the suggestion of a civil rights attorney when I explained to her the lengthy details of everything that we were going through that included death threats and things like that, primarily from one brother, but the other brothers kind of joined in. They have their own series of problems, mental health problems. But yeah, we were getting death threats. And again, my brother, the primary one, is claiming to be a religious leader, calls himself a pastor, claims that he runs ministries, and basically scams and dupes people on the internet into believing this. He has no qualifications for any of this. And he just unleashed himself on me through the use of the internet. Through defamation that was absolutely horrific. I'm an educator around children. He was accusing me of being a child abuser. He was accusing me of being a domestic terrorist. All kinds of crazy things. And we worked with our legislators. We worked with law enforcement. I did have an arrest warrant against him for harassment at one point. But nothing was being done on both the state and federal level. There was a federal cyber stalking law that we tried to get enforced. And repeatedly we were told by, in Connecticut primarily, but also by the feds in Georgia and the feds in Connecticut, that yes, he's breaking the law, but no, we're not going to put out the money to enforce the law. And that's just patently wrong. That's a violation of our most basic civil rights and our basic human rights to live in peace and quiet.
This is the background that led to your writing the book. What else happened? Give people a little bit of an idea of the timeline, because this didn't happen just in 2 or 3 weeks.
No, this actually has taken place from the early 2000s. I mean, really, it goes back earlier than that, but where he really started going after us was he would started suing us. It's called pro se, or you represent yourself by
Yes.
oneself without an attorney. It's quick and easy. Few $100s, you can sue anybody you want to for no reason whatsoever. And so we did everything we could to fight these lawsuits. We kept urging the judges to put some kind of injunction against him, and they just didn't care. We won every lawsuit. He sued other people, his ex-wife, a church that he was once involved with, his ex-wife's husband. He's probably sued a good number of people. We're just not aware of the full scope of it. In the end, he ended up suing our attorneys and judges. So we ended up getting both state and federal injunctions and judgments against him, with a treble amount, because he was deemed an abusive or vexatious litigant on both the state level and on the federal level. And so we have permanent injunctions against him because of this. But nobody should have to go through 9 lawsuits. It took 9 lawsuits to finally get full, complete justice. And we have been able to recover some of the judgment that we won against him. I consider it a miracle, because he is making money under the table somehow. He takes Mediterranean cruises and he takes other types of trips, and he can't do that on the income that he has claimed in the courts that he makes. So there's something kind of cheesy going on there, but
And I
yeah.
did want to ask you, tell us what jurisdiction you said you did get a federal injunction. What court, of course, federal courts sit in particular
Right.
states, and you have state courts. What states are we dealing with here?
It wasn't until we moved to Tennessee that we got the state judgment. That was the
Okay, you moved to a more
injunction.
conservative jurisdiction that
Absolutely.
tends to be more protective of civil
Yep.
rights, though also, generally speaking, in the South, we've seen more protection of religious rights. But in this case, I think that the judges saw pretty quickly that they didn't regard this as a religion that they, a traditional religion that they would normally protect. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, we were actually told by victim advocates in Connecticut, because of how dangerous my brother has proven himself to be. You need to flee to another state. You're never going to get
Yes.
justice in Connecticut.
And is he still in Connecticut, though? Is
Oh
he
no,
still operating?
he's been in Georgia the whole time,
Okay.
in Fulton County and now in Gwinnett County. And so,
These are big counties in Georgia, by the way. These are
right, and
both highly populated counties. Yes.
right, we've all heard about Fulton County.
Oh,
So,
yeah. It's
um,
quite a sight. What year did you publish your book, just so we get that on
it,
the
it,
record
it
here?
was at the end of, I believe, 2020. Let me think about this. 2021. I'm trying to remember,
Okay.
because yeah, and but yeah, we got the other federal injunction through the Northern Georgia federal courts. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So,
And then what we wanted you to visit on, because you caught us up at where we were in our first interview. What you have been working, especially subsequent to the publication of your book, on the legislative front to make it easier for you and others who are being harassed by such people to get some help. And so what has happened there?
yeah, just to kind of backstep a little bit, back in 2018, when he sued us here the first time, we contacted our legislators, and there was already a bill being proposed that would address abusive litigation. And we urged our legislators to join in with that. We told them our story. And so, consequently, with our story added into other victim stories, that law was passed, to stop abusive litigation and to impose penalties against people, such as permanent injunctions and judgments against them. Since that time, we have been trying to address other issues related to, like, for example, religious fraud. And it was a couple of years after this that Tennessee passed a law that anybody who gets a mail order ordination cannot perform marriages, because that is one of the tactics that a lot of cultists will do, is that they get these, mail order ordinations. They're really
Well,
quite ridiculous.
and it was very famous when I remember years ago, there was this Korean fellow running around, and he did like these mass marriages
Yeah.
in
The
stadiums and
Moonies.
stuff, the
Yep.
Moonies.
The
And
Moonies.
so when you mentioned the business about doing the weddings, I immediately thought of the good old Moonies. And of
Yeah.
course, a lot of these things, they hit a certain point and then they fade out as people realize that most of them, I don't want to say all of them, but most of them turn out to be something other than what people expected. And of course, the worst of them was Jim Jones,
Right. Yeah.
where he actually got a group of his followers to, because he was being legally investigated in the United States, moves down to South America, Central America, and
Yeah.
of course resulted in a horrible, horrible situation. But there's certainly quite a number of reports of people who have gone to something kind of regarding it like, oh, maybe this is kind of like going to a summer camp and we'll do some yoga
Right.
and all that. And then they find out that they can't leave and
Mhm.
things like that. So there's certainly been a lot of abuse of these opportunities, you might say, to have a gathering of people interested in a particular subject.
And it's like you mentioned that, one goes away, but there are so many others that crop up. And it used to be before the internet, it would take years, sometimes decades, for a cult to get off the ground because mostly the word was spread by word of mouth, sometimes by advertising, like in, newspapers or something like that. But now with the internet, these cult leaders can get followers within seconds, really. And that's the danger of the internet. But yeah, the Tennessee legislature, we have been supporting that. Unfortunately, then they did pass it into law, but it's being challenged legally in the courts. And it's just kind of sitting there. The judges really, I haven't read any new updates on that. But some other things that we've addressed is Tennessee, and I think some other states as well, have passed laws that put harsher penalties on clergy when they commit sexual offenses, either against children or against adults. And of course, I think we've all been reading in the newspapers over the last several years that there have been a statute of limitations that have been extended for
Yes.
child victims of sexual abuse by clergy. Whether these clergy are ordained officially through an organization or whether they're self-ordained. If they pass themselves off, they call themselves a pastor or a rabbi or a guru or a bishop or some other type of religious title, and they're operating in that way, then they are considered clergy. And so if they commit these offenses, then they can face harsher penalties in a state like Tennessee. Um, there's a situation actually in Maryville. They call it Merville here in Tennessee. I still haven't picked up the Tennessee accent, as you can tell. But and they have a sort of a charismatic Pentecostal type church that they had a school and they had teachers. And one of the teachers, at least one of them, was sexually abusing children. And unfortunately, the police department and apparently some court staff, and maybe including the prosecutor's office, were somehow connected or supportive of this church down in Maryville, Tennessee. And it's now being investigated by the Attorney General's office here in Tennessee because the perpetrator got a very light sentence, a mere slap on the wrist, which is a stab in the heart of the victims, the children.
Sure,
So
absolutely.
that is because, and this is where I emphasize, make your voice heard, is that a number of community members and others outside of the community have spoken up and demanded that the prosecutor, the district attorney, and the judge be held accountable for this ridiculously offensive sentence that does not address this guy still has his teaching license. It's like that is just unheard of. That is just inexcusable. So
Yeah.
these are the kinds of things that we are still doing. It is a slow process. I still wish that they would have a clergy authentication law where
Mhm.
nobody can claim to be a pastor or a guru or a rabbi without having certification from an accredited institution. And anybody can call himself a pastor. Anybody.
I think that's a wonderful suggestion. And Paulette, you touched on something a minute ago, and I wanted you to expand on it as our, kind of our third point is you talked briefly about how social media has enabled harassment, but how do you and other victims turn that around and use social media in a positive sense to communicate?
Yeah, years ago, we were advised by a number of attorneys to say, look, your brother, because he's out there calling himself a pastor, he's made himself a public figure, a
Yes.
limited purpose public figure. If he's addressing any kind of public issues or anything else, which he does, that makes him a public figure. And for that reason, we can access court documents, police records, which he has plenty of, and publish that for the sake of public interest, to warn people this guy is not who he portrays himself to be, and that these are the official public records. Police records and court records are public unless deemed otherwise by a judge. They are considered public record. And with that, you can use that to publish information. And far more people are doing that against these religious frauds, these cult leaders, these abusive clergy. Sometimes they're in denominations, sometimes they're just freewheeling it. And that is an important thing to remember, that we have a voice, that we have a free speech right to defend our names and reputations. Many times it's the tactic of cults to beat down people with defamation, to basically assassinate their character so
Yes.
that they can appear to be pure as the driven snow themselves. So we did that. We published information on the internet about my brother, and about anybody associated with him who also aided and abetted him. Now, also, what has been wonderful is that the US Congress, this is almost unheard of, where you have substantial bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate, given our divided times as they are, how divisive things are, that we were able to get passed in our legislators the Take It Down Act. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it has to do with anybody who's publishing information, primarily images, and in such a way that is sexually insulting to the person, whether they are engaged in intimate acts or whatever, or using AI to make them appear to be posing nude and things like this, or doing lewd acts of any sort.
And this is actually very timely because I just saw that Senator Ted Cruz here in Texas has
Yes.
proposed a new law that would ban trashing your former girlfriend and running images. And of course, now you don't even need to have taken a nude picture of your girlfriend.
Right.
You can just take her face and put it on a nude AI body, and
Exactly.
it's gotten really out of control. So I'm not I'm not endorsing Ted Cruz or not, but I'm just saying that I think that the law on a federal basis, I think, makes a lot of sense, because sometimes I get concerned because the internet is international and all
Right.
that. I did want to ask you quickly a follow-up on that. Are there any particular sites? I mean, are we talking Facebook, or is there any particular site that you find is particularly helpful? Because we also have things like Nextdoor, like I'm in my neighborhood's next door and things like that. I didn't know if you found a particular set of sites or sites that have been more useful than others for the concerned citizens.
They all come with benefits, but they also come with risks. And that's
Sure.
just the nature of the beast with the internet. And as you said, it's global. So, I mean, it really is a huge problem with how much can you control. The Take It Down Act, which has now become law, is great. But it's kind of like the federal stalking law. We tried to get that enforced. If you have a U.S. attorney or assistant U.S. attorney who is not willing to enforce the laws, and that's the problem we're seeing in a lot of areas in our country, where laws just are not being enforced by the police or by the district attorneys or state's attorneys or by the judges themselves. And so that's the crux of the matter. This is a great law. The federal cyber stalking laws were great laws, but can we get them enforced? And that is the
Absolutely.
issue. And the only way we can get that done is really put pressure on our judges. In some cases, judges are elected. In a lot of cases, they're appointed. But whatever the case is, we need to make our voices heard. That, and especially if we ourselves have been victimized in this way, we need to make our voices heard. I have dealt with people who have gone through far worse than I have, as bad as the situation has been. And I know the despair you can feel when it's like, nobody is helping me. My tax dollars are paying for these officials to do their jobs, and they're not doing their jobs. And so I think collectively, victims need to not give in to despair, but really utilize anger in a good way and keep persisting. Be that pain in the neck, be that squeaky wheel, and just keep persisting in insisting that your rights be upheld and your voice is heard.
Thank you so much, Paulette J. Buchanan. How can our audience get more information about you, your efforts regarding cults, and of course, your book?
My book website is fightingforjusticebook.com. And on that site, there is some more information, but you can also link to Amazon.com. You can look up my book even like in Walmart or Barnes and Noble. It's sold there as well. And also we have another site called stopabusivlawsuits.com. And that includes a boatload of information, a lot of documentation. It is an extensive website, but it backs up a lot of what I wrote about in my book.
Please proceed.
Continuing with the bad news is the rambling nuclear talks with Iran. Enough is enough. They are not going to make a deal since these are the most deranged of the three major threats to America. The longer this goes on, the more nuclear material they can assemble. Time to bomb, bomb, bomb Iran, as one popular song from 1980 by Vince Vance and the Valiants suggested. Only hit military and research facilities. The civilians in Iran have had enough. They are already prepared to rise up and save their country. Back in the Obama administration, there were clear-cut paths to which this were ignored. Let's provide financial and military support to the people to rid themselves of this cancer on their country and support a democracy there. As a longtime conservative and a professional educator, I love it when the liberals paint themselves into a corner. I was inspired by a story by David Strom in Hot Air titled, "After Ruining Education by Dropping Phonics, Liberals Discover Phonics Work." As a parent and grandparent, I cannot imagine teaching English to little children without sounding out the words. That's how we all learned, right? Well, that is until the liberals took over education, ignoring the way we humans learn language and to speak it. The push has been underway to teach differently. Not surprisingly, we've had massive national failure across our early grades. Strom's article claims that phonics are making a comeback, however. He contrasts the success over the last decade in Mississippi with the failure in California. He explained for decades, most school districts in California have been devoted to a different approach called whole language or balanced literacy, built on the belief that children naturally learn to read without being taught how to sound out words. Hopefully, the return of phonics will spread quickly and allow us college professors to start working with students who can speak, read, and write coherently. Otherwise, the remedial education at the expense, the high expense of a college education, will continue.
How does the defendant plead?
Business students, business persons, or consumers, business law impacts much of what you do. This segment is designed to help you get past the headlines on key stories. End of the line for a local business and its real estate. This is a sad case from a business owner's perspective. The Brinkmans own hardware stores. They bought a 1.7-acre lot in the town of Southold, New York. The plan was to build a big box store in the lot. The town tried to buy the property before the Brinkmans could close on it, but was unsuccessful. The backstory was that the town leaders did not want a big commercial store in that location. The Brinkmans were put through their paces responding to various objections by the town. When all else failed, the town forced the sale through eminent domain. The 2005 case of Kelo versus the City of New London is the leading SCOTUS case regarding a forced sale of property through eminent domain. In that case, the Kelo property was being combined with other properties to allow a big private sector development. Kelo argued that this was not a public use since it was going to eventually end up being privately. SCOTUS ruled against the property owner, Kelo. The Brinkmans appealed to the district court, alleging that the public purpose supporting eminent domain was a mere pretext. Their claim was that the town's whole play was simply to stop a commercial development that was legal in all other aspects. There was not a real plan for a public park. The district court ruled for the town, holding that pretext under these circumstances would not be a valid claim of pretext under part of the Kelo ruling. The Brinkmans appealed to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. That court's ruling was as follows. Plaintiffs argue that the exercise of eminent domain violates the takings clause if that public use, though real, is pretextual. We conclude when the taking is for a public purpose, courts do not inquire into alleged pretext and motives. The court then simply stated that the park is a public amenity that serves a public purpose. And SCOTUS just declined to review the Second Circuit's ruling, which means it's over, folks. Stands that way.
Please raise your right hand.
Supreme Court rejects Michael Cohen's civil rights claim against Trump and other officials. The Supreme Court rejected disbarred lawyers Michael Cohen's efforts to revive a civil rights claim against the former client of his, Donald Trump. And of course, he threw in a bunch of other federal officials who were in office in the year 2020. The basis for the suit was that in 2020, Cohen was serving a 3-year sentence on various charges, and he had been in home confinement because of the COVID-19 pandemic. That doesn't sound too bad, but was ordered back to prison after refusing to sign a form that would have prevented him from speaking to the press or posting on social media. Now, think about it. He's supposed to be in prison, and they said, we won't put you in prison if you act like you are in prison and stay out of sight. He refused to do that. After 16 days in solitary confinement, a federal judge ordered Cohen released, finding that officials had retaliated against him on free speech grounds. Cohen then sued Trump and the other officials, seeking damages for the alleged violation of his right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. U.S. District Judge Louis Lehman, a Trump appointee, dismissed Cohen's suit at the district court level. Lehman cited the 1971 Supreme Court case Bivens versus 6 unknown named agents. The case does allow federal officials to be sued in their individual capacity for violating a plaintiff's constitutional rights. However, it is tough to meet this conditions opposed by SCOTUS. In turn, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the district court's ruling. And per our headline, SCOTUS has declined to review the case, thus leaving the lower court rulings in place. In a very high-profile way, Cohen got his day in court when he testified against Trump in New York City in the highly publicized hush money case, although reports are that he faded when subjected to some strong cross-examination that challenged his version of the facts. Further, Cohen's book, Disloyal, a memoir, the true story of the former personal attorney for President Donald J. Trump, was a bestseller.
Objection, Your Honor.
Interesting employment discrimination case, including constructive discharge. Taiwa Iorinde worked for Team Industrial Services. His supervisor was unhappy with the quality of his work, which included poor welds and not passing a qualifying exam. Therefore, the employee was demoted, including a pay cut. He apparently protested the pay cut, and the pay cut was restored because his supervisor had not followed proper HR procedures of the company. However, Iorinde decided to quit the company and go after them for discrimination. He alleged in a charge with the EEOC a hostile work environment, race, national origin, and age discrimination, wrongful pay policies, retaliation, and constructive discharge. Yes, folks, the whole list. These days, the EEOC rarely pursues suits on individual claims, and that was true in this case. So he was issued a right to sue letter. This allowed him to file suit within 90 days, and he did timely file a lawsuit. Then things got interesting. Iorinde filed for summary judgment. That would be based on the facts being so clearly in his favor that trial would not be required. In turn, the employer filed for summary judgment. The judge in the trial court granted the summary judgment to the employer. So IRND filed an appeal. The appeals court agreed with the trial court that IRND did not provide sufficient evidence to support his claims. Specifically, IRND failed to show that he was treated less favorably than similarly situated employees outside his protected group. This is necessary to establish a prima facie case of race discrimination. Additionally, the court found no evidence of retaliation, and he had not exhausted his administrative remedies with regard to constructive discharge and hostile work environment claims. Note that constructive discharge is a tough case to prove. The employee must prove that things were so terrible at work that he had to quit.
May I remind you, you're still under oath.
As we grow up, a common reference for success or failure is the letter grade. Whether we're in grammar school or college, we all want an A grade and certainly regard an F as a big failure. Here at Saving America, we scan the news for reports of celebrities, politicians, or others who just end up in the public eye. So the A grades are awarded to people and organizations for great service to their communities, and the F grades, of course, are unfortunately more common, are awarded to those who need to do a lot better. The badge of dishonor today belongs to Kentucky Senator and until recently Republican leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell. My regular listeners know that it is critical to focus on ability, not age. Famed investor Warren Buffett, for instance, is 12 years older than McConnell and still plenty sharp. But then again, he's in the private sector and has to perform for his investors. So my criticism is based on the ludicrous fact that McConnell has been in politics for 49 years. His recent well-publicized fall underscores that it's time for him to go direct to the senior citizens' home and get his butt out of the government entirely. In my book, Bad Deal for America, he is one of the politicians that I feature for having long outlived their usefulness in Washington. Yet another poster child for term limits. Well, adding insult to injury, this leech on the taxpayers voted against Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense. He was one of only 3 GOP senators to vote against Hegseth. In fact, this forced a tie which new VP Vance was able to break. Thank goodness. Now, some are okay with the fact that this abuse of the taxpayers is no longer the Senate GOP leader. Of course, I'm glad about that since we have a competent senator who is now the Senate Majority Leader. However, it is time for doddering, mumbling Mitch to be sent home for good. So Saving America awards today's F grade to Mitch McConnell for abusing America by far outstaying his welcome in the nation's capital.
Motion denied.
Switching gears a bit. PRC persecution of Falun Gong spreads to the USA. My audience knows that I've expressed concern about the People's Republic of China persecution of the Chinese followers of the peaceful Falun Gong movement. In the US, Falun Gong has created Shenyun, a performing group which is set up as a nonprofit foundation. Turns out, recently, 2 Chinese agents pled guilty to acting as unregistered agents and bribing an IRS agent to take away the nonprofit status of Shenyun. This again emphasizes the importance of having a strong American government across the board that will not allow the PRC to do such shenanigans, certainly not inside the United States.
Silence in the court.
A number of states have already won suspension of the ridiculous Biden-Harris Title IX amendments. This is the ones that want to allow biological men into women and girls' restrooms in schools covered by Title IX. These rules were set up to protect women originally. These silly amendments would undo some of those important protections. In the latest ruling, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals granted a motion for an injunction. The court's strong opinion included this language. It is certainly highly likely that the department's new regulations defining discrimination on the basis of sex to include gender identity is contrary to the law and in excess of statutory authority. This appeals court covers Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina.
I'll allow it.
Foot Locker is closing more stores. I previously mentioned that Foot Locker would be closing some of its 2,400 stores. Well, they have announced they will add another 400 stores to the list being closed. By the way, its brand includes 125 Champ Sports. As I mentioned in previous reports, many large multi-unit operations have been cutting back as the economy changes rapidly. Others include Walgreens, CVS, GameStop, TGI Fridays, Walmart, Pizza Hut, Best Buy, Applebee's, and so on. It's a long list, folks. Interestingly, Foot Locker will be opening larger stores in the future, and the new format stores will exceed 400 locations. So they're going to close a bunch, including the previous announcement, but they're going to be adding these new big fancier stores they're hoping will attract more people.
Order in the court.
The attorneys general for about half the states have asked SCOTUS to block the new EPA methane standards for the oil and gas sector. The EPA claims that these new standards are part of its efforts to sharply reduce emissions of methane and other harmful air pollution from oil and natural gas operations. However, these attorneys general filed an emergency appeal to prevent the EPA from enforcing the rule that went into effect earlier this year. The basic claim is that the new EPA rules ignore the normal process for using certain technologies to achieve emission controls. Further, the 1 and 2 year time periods for implementation are simply too short. The supporting argument is that these new rules could be very costly, thereby imposing greater costs on consumers.
Sustained.
In something that should be a classic no-brainer, the U.S. Treasury Department has issued proposed rulemaking to expand the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS. This is a security committee which is supposed to review land purchases by foreign buyers near dozens of additional U.S. military sites. The proposed rule would increase the power of CFIUS to review land sales near 56 additional military sites. Now, Americans, where has this committee been when the Chinese and its surrogates have been buying up land near military bases all over the United States? I did not even know this committee existed. Let's get with it, folks. We need to get on top of it and stop allowing our enemies to buy land up near our base.
Silence in the court.
Chevron is leaving California for Houston by the end of this year. According to the report, Chevron has about 7,000 employees here in Houston already and about 2,000 at its headquarters in San Ramon, California. Chevron, of course, is one of the major oil companies in the world. This is a very significant development. I want to extend a warm welcome to the Chevron brass. They will find a pro-business environment here and, at least at the moment, some less expensive housing. I am sure the employees will like the fact that there's no state income tax.
The defense rests, Your Honor.
Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, who is the author of more than 20 books on compliance, business ethics, and the FCPA. He is the founder of the award-winning Compliance Podcast Network and the voice of compliance, as well as the author of the award-winning FCPA Compliance and Ethics blog. Mr. Fox has practiced law in Houston for greater than 30 years and serves as an independent consultant, assisting companies with anti-corruption and anti-bribery compliance, international transaction issues. He has served as in-house counsel at Drilling Controls Incorporated, a worldwide oil field manufacturing and service company, and also with the well-known Halliburton Energy Services. I've been in the Gray Houston Business Ethics Roundtable with you for about a decade now, and it's been a delight to work with you in that capacity. As you know, what we do is we provide 3 questions. And our first question is, tell our audience what all this compliance talk is all about. Would this just be handled by a company's legal staff or outside counsel?
Really, it should not be handled by legal staff, David, because an in-house legal department has one function and one function only, and that's to protect the organization. Compliance has a little bit different function. It is there to detect and hopefully prevent illegal conduct from occurring, but if it does, it's there to remediate or fix it. And that means transparency, obviously antithetical to the privilege that many corporations hide illegal actions or other actions from. So they're really two different focuses. Compliance is there to figure out what the problem is and fix it. And that it speaks to the difference, but the greater compliance obligations are generally around a set of regulatory or legal obligations. So they flow from that. And then how do you actually comply with those and inculcate those into the very culture of your organization?
Tom, we hear a lot about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is the acronym FCPA. What is it? Why do companies even need to worry about it?
Sure. The FCPA was the first international anti-corruption, anti-bribery law literally in the world. It was passed in 1977 within the Carter administration, and it was a response to corporate U.S. corporations engaging in bribery and corruption outside of the United States to the point where it was so public they were taking tax deductions for it. And a gentleman named Stanley Sporkin didn't think this was right, so he was largely the godfather and author of the FCPA. It served as a model for literally the rest of the world, and the rest of the world caught up around the first part of this century. And since that time, many other countries have passed their own anti-corruption laws. United Kingdom, France, Germany, Brazil, India, you name the country, they've got an anti-corruption law. What the FCPA prevents, David, is U.S. companies from engaging in bribery and corruption outside the United States. So the recent Supreme Court case around bribery and corruption or gratuities doesn't apply to the FCPA because that was a domestic law, and this is an international focus. So if you do business outside the United States, you're covered in some way, shape, and form by the FCPA.
Tom, just a follow-up on that. I actually am old enough to remember when the law was passed. I'm a little bit older than you, I think. And there was a projection that this would make the United States uncompetitive with other countries that allowed paying bribes. Did that actually turn out to be true?
You know, David, not only did that turn out not to be correct, but the entire storyline got flipped because the OECD and other international organizations saw the power of preventing corruption at the local level outside the United States. And the world loses $3 trillion each year to bribery and corruption. So it's a huge economic problem. And the OECD put pressure on these other countries to put substantive laws in place. So, for instance, in 2010, the United Kingdom passed what they call their Bribery Act. That was their first bribery act since 1909. And as I mentioned, France, Brazil, Germany, most other Western countries have passed laws. And those, instead of this being a business deficiency or causing the U.S. to lose business, it's actually gone the other way. And many U.S. companies now are seen as prime providers of services because they do not pay bribes, and the money that they spend in a country goes to that country, not to line the pocketbooks of politicians.
That's so helpful, Tom. And our third question, share with our audience about your book, The Compliance Handbook, A Guide to Operationalizing Your Compliance Program. I understand it's now in the 5th edition. And how does that help businesses?
Well, I'm going to have the temerity to have a copy right here and show you. But yes, this is my signature work. It is, in my humble opinion, the best one-author volume on doing compliance or operationalizing compliance. David, as you mentioned, some of the companies I work for, I came out of the corporate world when I was exposed to compliance when I was still in the legal department. And it struck me that compliance, properly seen as a business process. Yes, it's in a response to legal and regulatory requirements, but it's really a process. And if it's a business process, you can study it, you can measure it, you can manage it, you can monitor it, you can improve it, because it's just like any other process. So I'm really tried to, for the last 15 years, talk about compliance as a business process, try to explain to companies this is not something to be afraid of, because more effective compliance equates to more efficient business processes, and at the end of the day leads to higher ROI and profitability. So that if I believe, as properly seen as a business process, if you implement an appropriate business process to manage a risk, you're going to be a better run company.
And part of that situation is are not international companies required to have a compliance program to fit the requirements of the FCPA? And isn't there bonuses or at least some rewards for companies that have tested and established their compliance programs?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, David, because initially compliance programs were put in to comply with that law, the FCPA. The Department of Justice over the past 15 years has given a plethora of guidance on what their view of a best practices compliance program. But David, the more interesting approach is what I saw in the city of Houston, specifically in the energy industry. The first decade of this year, there was an industry sweep in energy for FCPA violations. Houston, Texas is the FCPA capital of the world because of energy and energy companies in Houston. But what was interesting, David, was the business response. The operating companies, the Exxons, the Chevrons of the world, they had gold standard programs. Well, immediately below that are the service companies, Baker Hughes, Weatherford, Halliburton, et cetera. And if you wanted to do work, you had to do work with one of those service companies, literally down to the $15 million software company that had one piece of software that bolted on something downhole and did something. And I represented a company like that. And I told them, if you want investment dollars, if you want a contract with a Baker Hughes, with a Halliburton, with a Weatherford, you're going to have a compliance program. And I finally talked them into letting me put a compliance program in. 2 weeks later, one of those companies came for a big investment. And the second thing they asked for was, we want to see your compliance program. It's a long-winded way of saying that compliance in energy is driven as a business initiative. And it's not so much that you have to have a program to get benefits from the government if you get in trouble. But if you want to do business in the energy industry or tech or financial services or pharma, or you name the industry, you have to have a compliance program. And so that's the part I try to focus on, David, is to try to indicate to people that it's a business response to a legal problem, but it's a business process. So let's put that process in place. Let's make it transparent. If somebody comes knocking and wants to review your program, you can show that to them. You're not going to show them trade secrets, but you can certainly show them the 8 or 10 elements of your compliance program. So Houston is the best example of a business response to the legal issue of international anti-corruption.
Tom Fox, it's been a delight having you on again. We've known each other for about a decade now, and first time I've had you over on Saving America. Tell our audience about how they can get more information on you and your publications.
Sure. First of all, they can reach out to me via email at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. I'm always available on LinkedIn, Thomas R. Fox. If you're interested in learning more about compliance in the podcast format, I am the guy. I have founded the Compliance Podcast Network, which is www.compliancepodcastnetwork.net. So any of those, you can reach me, and I look forward to catching up with anybody who might want more information on compliance or the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
This session is adjourned.
Thanks for joining me for Saving America. If you have questions or comments, please find me on various social media sites. I'm Dr. David D. Schein, and I will see you next week.
Welcome to USA Global TV and Radio, where our mission is to provide education, entertainment, hope, and inspiration. USA Global TV and Radio connects you with experts and audiences all around the world every single day to help you succeed in business and to live a richer life. Visit us at usaglobaltv.com to learn about career and life-changing training and mentoring programs like the Listening Mentor. Subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about our special programs and offers. Discover how you can become a guest on one of our shows or a host or producer of a USA Global TV and Radio show of your very own. That's USA Global TV and Radio, where the doctor is always in.